Take a look at this book. It is literally falling apart in my hands. Let me smell it. Dear Lord, it is heinous. Let this book serve as a warning about what can happen when we don't protect our comic books. Hi, how you doing? I'm Keston and I love comic books. Yet comics have a huge Achilles heel. They are extremely delicate collectibles. How you store, how you protect your books has huge bearing on their condition. And in turn, condition has huge bearing on price. For example, Thrilling Comics number 62 in near mint condition is a $2,000 book. The condition that you see it in here, this book is probably worth $10 at best. There are so many forces at play trying to turn your valuable paper into dust. This video is about knowing your enemy. I'm going to cover the top 10 threats to comic book preservation. Oh, sunshine, you bring us such light and great warmth, and you help plants grow. But for comic books, you're an absolute killer. Your UV light will turn white pages brittle. That glossy cover turns faded super fast. So my suggestion to you is treat your comic books like vampires. Keep them out of direct sunlight. I'd also avoid garlic, crucifixes, wooden stakes, and silver bullets. The next threat is too much moisture. On the extreme end, you might have a flood that comes in that just knocks out your entire collection. Of course, that would be horrible. On the less extreme end and more common is storing your comic books in an area that's too moist. Oftentimes, this is a basement. Let's take a look at Thrilling Comics 62 again. This is basically a victim of too much moisture. So if we look on the back of this book, can you see all the black there? That's basically mold from the moisture. Another area of concern are the staples. With too much moisture, you'll see oxidation that turns into rust. And so this staple is, I think, almost gone, deteriorated because of the rust. And you can see that the rust has gone all the way through the book. If we were to open up the pages, you would see the rust permeate all the way through the pages near that staple. Obviously not good. Hamburger, chicken fingers, spaghetti, sushi, they all sound appetizing to me. But to a silverfish, your comic book paper is what's for dinner. Book chew is no joke. The value of many comic books have been decimated by the mandibles of six-legged creatures. Let me show you an example. This is Exciting Comics number 65, an otherwise beautiful book. The cover is still glossy, but look what's happening here. On the upper part of this book, you can see that a bug has chewed on many places. When I look at the spine on the upper side, that's been hit by bug chew. Let me flip it over, and you can see what happened to the bottom of the cover as well. So this was a book that, gosh, I guess would probably be a 7.0 or a 7.5 that's reduced to maybe a 1.0 because of bug chew. What's that sound? Oh, dear Lord, it's rat chew. We're going to move from six-legged threats to four-legged threats. Specifically, I'm talking about rodents. And what could a rodent do to a comic book? Let me show you. This is Thrilling Comics number 65. And check out that corner. It has been absolutely destroyed by a rat. Otherwise, this book is beautiful. It's glossy. The corners are tight. But with that damage, you ain't getting higher than a 1.5. We're going to move from four-legged threats to two-legged threats. What type of beast are we talking about exactly? We're talking about the most dangerous beast of them all, children. Now, there's been research to show that play is really good for kids. It helps their creativity, it helps in their socialization, and so forth. But the comic books, it's not a good idea to have children playing near your comic books. Now, of course, just them handling the comic books can cause a lot of wear and tear. Creases, the spine looks bad, sometimes there's rips, and so forth. But here, I'm talking about a particular type of play that is terrible, and that is drawing on comic books. And I'm going to show you a few examples. So here's one. This is Exciting Comics number 65. And do you see that tracing that's going on around Judy of the Jungle? So there are blue lines going around there. So tracing is really common. I picked this one because it's really easy to see on video, but tracing is common. And then you get some more, what would you say, creative writing on here, creative drawing. So this is Judy of the Jungle, again, in Exciting Comics number 63. And in this case, you can see there's basically graffiti all over Judy of the Jungle. Let's take a look at another book. This is Sterling Comics number 47, a really well-known cover in the hobby. And if we look at it, it seems as if a 3-year-old came up to this book, had a pen, and just started marking on it. It's haphazard. It looks terrible. This type of graffiti will really bring the grade down. Now, otherwise, without these markings, this book is probably a 6 or a 6.5. CGC gave this book a 2.5. That being said, if I were to take this book, this 2.5, and put it against another 2.5 book, I would think that this book would sell for less. People just don't like defaced covers. Now, by the way, if you are offended by me talking about children as being threats, just wait till we get to threat number 8. Flashback, here's a tune for you. You're hot and you're cold, you're yes and you're no. That was a number 3 hit back in 2008 by Katy Perry, a song called Hot and Cold. No, this threat isn't about bad singing. Instead, it's about extreme temperature fluctuations. If in the environment a comic book experiences hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold, it'll do a lot of damages, particularly to the page quality. It will go from white to cream to tan and then to brittle. So please try to avoid extreme temperature changes. Again, it's best to keep comics in a cool, dry area. This next threat is special because it's unique to each one of us. What am I talking about? I'm talking about these. It's your fingers. And specifically, I'm talking about the tips. What do they leave behind? Fingerprints. And if you're handling comic books and you're not careful and your hands aren't clean, then your fingerprints will often be left on the covers of books. This is a more subtle type of defect. Nonetheless, it can bring down the grade. This often comes into play in high-grade books. For example, I've seen a book that would likely be a 9.2 brought down to a 9 or an 8.5 because of fingerprints. So if you're handling comic books, make sure that your fingers are clean or you just don't touch the cover at all with your fingers. Now we're at number 8, and I told you you might be offended by it. Why? Because it's the oldest insult on the playground. It is your mama, right? Your mama. That's usually followed by some kind of joke. But instead of a joke, we're talking about a threat to comic books because it's your mama that threw away your comic book collection. I've talked to so many people who collected comic books in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, and they would tell me about this great collection that they had, all gone because their mom was decluttering and either gave away or sold their comic books. If we're talking about comic book preservation, well, the number one enemy is probably your mama. This next threat doesn't happen too often, but when it does, it's extremely painful to the comic book owner. It's tape pull. Let me give you a little context. Many collectors will put their books on boards and then bag them. This really helps protect the comic book. For example, this is what a boarded and bagged comic book looks like. This is Silver Surfer number 4, by the way. Now, you'll notice too that people put often a strip of tape there to seal up the bag. Now, what happens sometimes is when people start to take their comic book out, that they'll peel off the tape, they'll pull the book out, and the cover will stick to the tape. Oh my gosh, this is a really painful thing that can happen. In fact, it happened to me. Back in about 2012, I was collecting Silver Age keys, got a raw copy of Daredevil Comics number 1, the first appearance of Daredevil, and I was pulling out that book, and that piece of tape caught the book. Oh, it was bad news. I spent about half an hour just carefully trying to take that tape from the cover. Nevertheless, I think that tape pull still showed a little bit. The book came back as a 5.5 from CGC. I think it probably would have been a 6.0 had it not been for that tape pull. I certainly learned my lesson. Now I just take the tape completely off the bag and throw it out. And then when I rebag the book, I'll take another piece of tape and put it on there. Trying to save half a cent for some tape is not worth the risk to your comic books. The last threat is the improper stacking of comic books. Back in the day, many people didn't have bags or boards, nor did they know how to stack their comic books properly. So what they would often do is they would take their raw comic book and they would put it down flat, and then they would lay other comic books on top of that. There's at least a couple things that are bad that can happen. So one is something called spine roll. Let me explain. If you are laying down comic books and they're all facing the same direction, then the spines are going to be on top of one another. The spines are a little bit thicker than the rest of the book because there's a staple in the spine. So what happens when all these books are on top of each other, they get compressed. And so you have a book like this. It's Exciting Comics number 61. And if you look at the spine, you see how it's folded out there? That's actually spine roll. So this was part of a stack and it got crushed and the spine rolled over to make the book flatter overall. Something else that can happen is that parts of a book, if they're stacked up, are going to be not part of the stack, but slightly exposed because the books aren't lined up exactly flush. So here's a couple examples. This is Exciting Comics number 65, a different copy than you saw before, the Rat Chew copy. And this book, you can see on the top and on the side there, where it's a lot darker, that's where this book was a little askew of the stack, and these pieces were sticking out, exposed to the elements. And so these parts of the book are much more degraded than the other parts. Here's another more even extreme example. This is Thrilling Comics number 61. Guys, this is a beautiful book otherwise. I mean, this spine is absolutely gorgeous. However, look what happened to the parts of the book that were exposed to the elements. Really, really degraded. In fact, this little chunk right here came out just now, unfortunately, because this part of the book is brittle. If you want to find out more about protecting your comic books, I suggest this video. If you're interested in how to price a comic book, check out this video. Thanks so much for hanging with me, and I hope to see you around real soon.